floorboards were frozen knives against her skin. Anli drew her knees to her chest, a small, shivering knot of faded pink fabric in the vast, decaying heart of the abandoned ranch house. Her dress, a pale relic from a life that now seemed a century gone, offered no warmth. Only the gray, tattered blanket, smelling of dust and her own fear, provided a thin shield against the winter's invading chill. Each breath was a painful cloud of white mist, a fragile testament to the life still flickering within her. The pain was a constant companion, a deep, throbbing ache in her ribs, and a sharp fire across her cheek where her brother's ring had split the skin. It was a physical map of her family's final verdict. She remembered the guttural fury in her father's voice, the cold dismissal in her brother's eyes. They had dragged her here, to this place where forgotten things came to die, and left her with a finality that was more brutal than any blow. "You are a ghost to us now," Bao, her father, had snarled, his words swallowed by the wind that tore at the broken shutters. June, her brother, had simply thrown the blanket at her feet. No remorse, no hesitation, just the quiet, efficient cruelty of a man discarding something he no longer had a use for. She had been their asset, their currency, until she had refused. Refused the marriage to a man twice her age with hands like weathered leather and a reputation for breaking his horses and his wives with equal indifference. Her refusal was not an act of courage. It was an act of self-preservation, a desperate instinct to keep the last flicker of her own soul from being extinguished. And for that, they had brought her here, to be erased by the cold, the hunger, the silence. The sun, a weak, watery disk in the gray sky, offered no comfort. It only illuminated the dust motes dancing in the shafts of frigid air, each one a tiny, indifferent star in her desolate universe. Hunger was a hollow cavern inside her, an ache that had long ago passed the point of sharp pangs and settled into a dull, gnawing emptiness. She had tried to eat snow, but it only stole what little warmth she had left. She was a daughter of a faraway land, a place of vibrant silks and warm rains, now stranded in a monochrome landscape of frost and unforgiving timber. The world had shrunk to the 4 crumbling walls of this room, to the splintered wood beneath her, to the relentless, silent siege of the cold. She closed her eyes, the bruises on her face pulling tight. The image of her father's face, contorted with rage, was seared behind her eyelids, the memory of her brother's casual brutality. They had done this. Her own blood. She wrapped the blanket tighter, a useless gesture. The cold was not just outside her. It was inside her now, creeping into her bones, slowing her heart. She was 20 years old, and she was waiting to die. Abner moved through the snow-laden forest with the quiet purpose of a river carving through stone. He was a man made of the mountain itself, broad of shoulder, thick of limb, his presence as solid and unyielding as the ancient pines that surrounded his cabin. A wild, dark beard, shot through with threads of gray, fell to his chest, and his hair, long and untamed, was often tied back with a simple leather thong. His eyes, deep set beneath a heavy brow, missed nothing. The snap of a twig under a deer's hoof 100 yards away. The subtle shift in the wind's direction. The faint, unnatural sound that had drawn him down from the higher elevations today. It wasn't the cry of a predator or the whimper of a lost calf. It was something else. A thin, intermittent sound, almost lost in the keening of the wind through the high passes. A sound of distress that was distinctly human, yet so faint it was more a feeling than a noise. He followed it, his massive frame navigating the treacherous, snow-covered terrain with an economy of motion that belied his size. His instincts, honed by years of solitary existence, led him away from his usual trapping lines and toward the skeletal remains of the old McPherson Ranch, a place shunned by the elements and by men. It sat in a low, wind-scoured valley, a monument to failed ambition. As he drew closer, the feeling grew stronger. He saw the tracks first. 2 sets of heavy boots coming and going, and a third set, smaller, dragged between them. He stopped, his gaze sweeping the scene, reading the story written in the snow. A struggle, not a clean one. He approached the main house, his hand resting not on a weapon, but simply held open at his side, a gesture of readiness. The front door hung askew on a single hinge, a dark, gaping mouth. The wind moaned through it. He stepped across the threshold, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The air was thick with the scent of decay, frost, and something else, a faint metallic tang. He moved from room to room, his soft-soled moccasins making no sound on the frozen floorboards. In the last room, the one facing the unforgiving north, he found her. She was a heap of pale pink and gray, so still he thought at first that he was too late. Then he saw the faintest tremor run through her body, a shiver so profound it seemed to come from the very marrow of her bones. He saw the dark, ugly bruises on her face, the split lip, the delicate lines of her form curled in on itself against an impossible cold. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, a giant framed against the bleak winter light, his expression unreadable. He had seen the brutality of men before, in the towns and mining camps he had long since abandoned. He had not expected to find it here, in his silent kingdom. He took a slow step into the room, and her head lifted just an inch. Her eyes, wide and dark with terror, fixed on him. A wounded animal, cornered and expecting the final blow. He did not speak. Words were clumsy, intrusive things in a moment like this. Instead, he knelt, the motion slow and deliberate, sinking onto one knee on the frosted planks a few feet from her. He could feel the cold seeping through his thick buckskin trousers, a pale imitation of the deep chill that had settled into her very core. Her eyes tracked his every move, the fear in them a raw, physical thing. He was a giant of a man, and his presence filled the small, decaying room, blotting out what little light there was. To her, he must have looked like another nightmare, another form of violence made manifest. He saw the dress, the absurdly delicate pink, stained with dirt and, he suspected, blood. He saw the blanket, thin as a prayer. He saw the fine tremor in her hands, the blue tinge of her lips. He remained kneeling, letting the silence stretch, giving her time to see that his hands were empty, his posture unthreatening. He was giving her time to measure him, just as he was measuring the depth of her hurt. Finally, he extended one large, calloused hand, palm up, not toward her, but into the space between them. It was an offering, an invitation without words. She flinched, pulling back so sharply she winced as the movement jarred her bruised ribs. He held his hand steady, unmoving. He waited. The rhythmic puff of his own breath was the only sound. He watched her gaze flicker from his face to his hand and back again. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the instinct to flee, warring with the profound exhaustion that pinned her to the floor. After a minute that felt like an hour, he slowly withdrew his hand and began to unlace the heavy oilskin pouch at his hip. Her eyes widened again, a fresh wave of fear washing over her. He moved with painstaking slowness, pulling out a small metal flask. He unscrewed the cap and placed it carefully on the floor. Then he slid the flask itself across the splintered wood. It stopped a foot from her. "Water," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. It was the first word spoken between them, and it hung in the frigid air, simple and direct. She stared at the flask, then back at him. Her throat worked, but no sound came out. He knew that if she stayed here, she would be dead by morning. The decision had already been made, from the moment he saw the drag marks in the snow. This was his mountain, his territory. And what happened here happened on his watch. He rose to his full height, a slow, fluid motion. She pressed herself against the wall, a small, desperate sound escaping her lips. He ignored it, turning his back to her, a deliberate act of trust, and walked to the doorway. He shrugged off his heavy outer coat, a massive thing of sheepskin and wool, and laid it on the floor. Then he turned back to her. "I will carry you," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. There was no question in it, no room for debate. It was a statement of fact. He stepped forward, and this time she did not have the strength to pull away. He bent and slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. Her body was stiff with fear, but also terrifyingly light. He wrapped her in his coat, cocooning her in its warmth and the scent of pine smoke, leather, and snow. As he carried her out of the house of ghosts and into the biting wind, he felt a faint, shuddering sigh escape her. She had finally let go. The journey to his cabin was a silent, arduous climb. Abner moved with the steady, relentless pace of a man who understood the mountains not as an obstacle, but as a partner in a difficult dance. He held Anli close to his chest, his own body a furnace against the cold that sought to reclaim her. She was a fragile weight in his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder, lost in a state somewhere between consciousness and oblivion. The wind howled, whipping snow into their faces, but he merely lowered his head and pushed onward, his legs churning through the deepening drifts. He could feel the shallow, rapid beat of her heart against his ribs, a frantic little bird trapped in a cage of bone. Each step was a deliberate act of defiance against the men who had left her, against the winter that sought to finish their work. He did not think about the consequences of his actions, not yet. He operated on a simpler, more primal level. Something was broken, and he was taking it somewhere to be mended. Something was lost, and he was carrying it home. His cabin was nestled in a small, sheltered bowl on the mountainside, protected by a stand of ancient, towering firs. It was a simple structure of thick, hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney breathing a steady plume of gray smoke into the sky. It was a part of the landscape, not an intrusion upon it. He kicked the heavy plank door open and stepped inside, into the sudden, welcome embrace of warmth. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a flickering, golden light across the single room. The air smelled of wood smoke, drying herbs, and roasting meat. He crossed the floor and gently, so gently, laid her down on the thick pile of furs that served as his bed. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and unfocused, taking in the strange new surroundings. The rough-hewn walls, the rack of snowshoes, the simple wooden table and 2 stools, the overwhelming presence of him. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. She tried to push herself up, a weak, panicked movement. "Easy," Abner's voice rumbled from across the room. He did not approach. He stood by the fire, ladling something from an iron pot into a wooden bowl. The scent of a rich, savory stew filled the air. He placed the bowl on the table, along with a cup of water. He moved without hurry, his actions measured. "Eat," he said, gesturing to the table with his head. He did not command, he stated a necessity. She stared at him, then at the food. Her stomach cramped with a painful, desperate hunger. But the fear held her frozen. Who was this man, this giant who had plucked her from her frozen grave and brought her to his lair? Was he a savior, or simply a different kind of captor? The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. He seemed to understand her paralysis. He picked up one of the stools, walked it over to the far side of the room, and sat down, putting as much distance between them as the small cabin would allow. He began to methodically clean a rifle, his large hands surprisingly nimble. He did not look at her again. He was giving her space. The choice was hers. Slowly, painfully, An-Li pushed herself up. Every muscle screamed in protest. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching a warm bearskin rug. She looked at the food, then at the man. His back was to her. She took a hesitant step, then another. Finally, she reached the table and sank onto the stool, her hands trembling as she picked up the spoon. The first taste of the warm stew was an agony of pleasure. It was life. It was warmth. It was a promise. She ate, her eyes never leaving the back of the massive man who sat in the corner, guarding the door, guarding the fire, guarding her. The next few days unfolded in a slow, silent rhythm. Abner moved about his life with a quiet consistency that was, in its own way, a form of communication. He would rise before dawn, stoke the fire, and disappear into the gray morning, returning hours later with firewood or a freshly snared rabbit. He never announced his departures or his arrivals. He simply was, or he was not. He left food for An-Li on the table, a bowl of oatmeal, a piece of hard bread, a portion of whatever was simmering in the pot over the fire. He spoke only when necessary, his words spare and functional. More wood. Snow is coming. That needs tending. He gestured to the gash on her cheek, which was beginning to look raw and infected. He placed a small tin of dark, pungent salve on the table and a clean strip of linen. He did not offer to apply it. He simply provided the means. The unspoken message was clear. Your body is your own. I will not touch you without permission. An-Li watched him, her fear slowly receding, replaced by a deep, cautious curiosity. She spent most of her time huddled in the furs, the gray blanket from the ranch house clutched around her shoulders like a shield. She watched his hands as he repaired a snowshoe, the immense strength in them used with such precision and care. She listened to the steady sound of his breathing as he slept on a pile of furs on the other side of the hearth. He never crossed the invisible line that divided the cabin into his space and hers. In this small, warm world, bounded by the log walls and the raging winter outside, a fragile truce was being built, one silent gesture at a time. On the third day, she found the courage to speak a full sentence. He had just returned, shaking snow from his coat, and had placed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle on the table. He unwrapped it to reveal a pair of thick woolen stockings and a simple dark wool dress, worn but clean. He had traded for them on a trip to a distant, isolated trading post, a journey he made only a few times a year. "For you," he grunted, pushing them toward her side of the table. She stared at the clothes. They were practical, warm, devoid of the fragile vanity of her pink prairie dress, which now lay in a heap in the corner, a sad reminder of a life that was no longer hers. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since he'd found her. His gaze was steady, without pity. "Winter is long," he said. It was not an answer, but it was enough. It acknowledged the reality of her situation without dwelling on its horror. It implied a future. Later that day, as he sat mending a tear in his buckskin shirt, she finally picked up the tin of salve. Her hands were still clumsy, and she winced as she gently cleaned the cut on her face. He watched her from the corner of his eye. When she was done, she looked up and met his gaze. "My father," she said, her voice barely audible, touching her cheek. "And my brother. They did that." He just nodded, a slow single dip of his chin. He did not offer condolences or ask for details. He simply accepted her truth. The words, once spoken, hung in the air, changing the shape of the silence between them. It was no longer a silence of fear, but one of shared knowledge. The foundation of trust, fragile as new ice, had begun to form. You see, a person's world can be shattered by the very hands that were supposed to build it. It is a specific kind of devastation, a betrayal so fundamental it rewrites the soul. To be broken by a stranger is a misfortune. To be broken by your own blood is to be orphaned from the very idea of safety. An Lee's healing was more than the fading of bruises or the knitting of bone. It was the slow, painful process of learning to inhabit her own skin again, to trust the ground beneath her feet. In the quiet solitude of Abner's cabin, she began this work. The pink dress was folded and put away, a relic of a girl who no longer existed. In the practical wool dress, she was someone else, someone warmer, someone more solid. She began to move around the cabin, at first with the tentative steps of a ghost, then with a growing sense of purpose. She swept the hearth. She added wood to the fire. She learned the rhythm of the place, the simple, honest labor of survival. Abner accepted her contributions with the same quiet gravity with which he did everything else. Her presence became part of the cabin's ecosystem, another steady heartbeat alongside his own and the fire's. One afternoon she was scrubbing the stew pot when he came and stood behind her. She stiffened, her old fear a phantom limb. He simply placed a bucket of clean water, hauled from the half-frozen creek, beside her. "Easier," he said, and walked away. A small act, a simple courtesy, but in her world it was a profound gesture of respect. It was a stark contrast to the life she had known, where her labor was demanded, expected, and never acknowledged. Here her efforts were seen. They were made easier. The past was a constant presence, a shadow she carried. She would find herself staring into the fire, reliving the sharp, metallic taste of fear as her brother held her down, her father's face a mask of righteous fury. He had called her defiant, ungrateful, a stain on his honor, all because she had said no, all because she had dared to believe her life was her own to give, not his to sell. Her father, Bao, had always seen her as a commodity. Her brother, June, had seen her as a burden. They were men who measured the world in profit and loss, in power and control. A daughter with a will of her own was a liability, so they had tried to erase her. What they didn't count on was the mountain. They didn't count on a man like Abner, a man who lived by a different ledger, a man who measured the world in seasons, in the weight of a snowfall, in the honesty of an animal's struggle for life. He was a force of nature, and she, by a strange and violent twist of fate, had fallen under his protection. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, sealing them in their warm, small world, he looked up from the harness he was mending. "You have a name?" he asked. It was the first personal question he had ever posed. She had been with him for weeks, and he had never asked. She had been a creature he had saved, a responsibility he had shouldered. Now he was asking for her humanity. "An Lee," she said. He nodded, testing the sound of it. "An Lee," he repeated softly. He did not offer his own name. It didn't matter. In the heart of the unforgiving winter, she had been given a new one. Survivor. The town of Redemption was a muddy street and a handful of false-fronted buildings clinging to the edge of a frozen river, a place that held on to civilization by its fingernails. It was here that Bao and June arrived, their faces grim, their patience worn thin by the cold and the futility of their search. They had waited, assuming the winter would do their work for them, but a persistent, nagging doubt had taken root. What if she had survived? What if she had been found? A loose end was a dangerous thing. Their first stop was the general store, a cluttered space that smelled of coffee, cured leather, and damp wool. Mr. Davies, the proprietor, a man whose spine was as flexible as his profit margins, greeted them with a practiced, weary smile. Bow did the talking, his voice polite but with an undercurrent of steel. "We're looking for our sister," he said, producing a description that was both accurate and deeply false. "A young woman, delicate, prone to wandering. She has a fragile mind." He painted a picture of a beloved, troubled family member, lost and in need of rescue. June stood behind him, his silence more menacing than any threat. Mr. Davies listened, his gaze shifting nervously. He had heard whispers. A trapper passing through a week ago had spoken of the recluse up on the North Range, Abner, trading a prime wolf pelt for women's clothes. It was unusual. It was notable. But Davies was a man who valued his business, and more than that, his quiet life. Getting involved was bad for both. "Can't say I've seen anyone like that," he lied, his eyes refusing to meet Bow's. "Folks keep to themselves this time of year." Bow's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "We'd be very grateful for any information. There's a reward." He placed a few coins on the counter, a down payment on a man's conscience. Davies looked at the money, then back at the two men. He knew trouble when he saw it. This wasn't about a lost sister. This was about a retrieval. Their next stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller was a man sinking into the comfort of his own inertia. He'd taken the job in Redemption because it was quiet, and he intended to keep it that way. He listened to Bow's story with a practiced air of disinterest, leaning back in his chair, his boots propped on his desk. "The North Range?" Miller grunted, picking at his teeth with a sliver of wood. "Nothing up there but snow, rock, and Abner, and you don't want to go bothering him." "This man Abner," June spoke for the first time, his voice low and sharp. "Does he live alone?" "As alone as a man can get," the sheriff said. "Keeps to himself, causes no trouble. That's the way I like it." "If he found our sister," Bow pressed, "he would be obligated to report it. It's the law." Sheriff Miller finally swung his boots off the desk and leaned forward, his expression souring. "The law gets thin up on that mountain. My advice? Go home. Wait for the thaw. If she's out there, the winter's already got her." He had no interest in trekking up a mountain in a blizzard for a fragile Chinese girl, especially not on the word of two men who radiated an aura of cold violence. He was officially washing his hands of it. As Bow and June left the office, the frigid wind biting at their faces, they exchanged a look. The law would not help them. The town would not help them. But they had what they needed: a name and a direction. North. Abner knew they were coming before he saw them. He felt it in the stillness of the air, a subtle disturbance in the mountain's rhythm. He had gone down to the river to check a line of snares and found the tracks near the old collapsed bridge. Two men on foot, moving with a purpose that was not that of a hunter or a trapper. They were man-hunters. He followed their trail for a quarter-mile, his face a granite mask. They were clumsy city men, but they were determined. He returned to the cabin as the light began to fail, the setting sun painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of blood and gold. An Lee was by the fire, mending one of his shirts, a small domestic scene of impossible peace. She looked up as he entered, and she saw the change in him immediately. The quiet stillness he usually carried had been replaced by a different kind of quiet, a coiled, watchful tension. "What is it?" she asked, her needle pausing mid-stitch. He did not answer directly. He moved to the single window, peering out into the descending dusk. He checked the heavy bar on the door. His movements were economical, precise, but charged with a new and dangerous energy. The warmth of the cabin suddenly felt fragile, a tiny bubble of safety in a vast and hostile world. "Stay away from the window," he said, his voice a low command. Fear, a familiar and unwelcome guest, returned to her. It settled cold and heavy in her stomach. "Who is it?" she whispered, though she already knew. The world was large, but her past had a long reach. He finally turned to face her, his expression grim. 2 men. That was all he said. It was all he needed to say. The fragile peace they had built was about to be tested. The sanctuary he had provided was about to become a fortress. He took the rifle he had been cleaning days before and propped it by the door. He did not check to see if it was loaded. It was always loaded. He took a heavy axe, its blade home to a razor's edge, and placed it on the table. Not as a weapon for her, but simply as a tool, now imbued with a deadly potential. The cabin, once a haven, was now a cage. Anli's hands began to tremble. She put the shirt down, her fingers too clumsy to continue. She thought of Bal's rage, of June's cold eyes. They had found her. They had come to finish what they started. She looked at Abner, this mountain of a man who had shown her a quiet, profound kindness she had never known. He had saved her from the cold, but could he save her from her own blood? He seemed to read the fear in her eyes. He walked to the table and poured 2 cups of water from the bucket. He handed one to her. His fingers brushed hers, and his hand was as steady as the rock of the mountain. "Drink," he said. It was the same tone he had used when he first found her, a simple, grounding instruction in the face of chaos. She took the cup, her eyes locked on his. In his gaze she saw no fear, only a deep, unshakable resolve. He was not going to run. He was not going to hide. He was going to stand his ground. This was his mountain, and she, for now, was part of it. The wind picked up, shrieking around the corners of the cabin like a gathering of ghosts. The waiting began. The crunch of boots on snow came just after dawn, a heavy, deliberate sound that cut through the morning's silence. Abner was already awake, standing by the door, a motionless silhouette against the faint light. Anli sat on the edge of the furs, her hands clenched in the rough wool of her dress, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She could hear them now, their low voices muffled by the thick log walls. Then a sharp, authoritative rap on the door. Abner did not move. Silence. Another rap, louder this time, impatient. "We know she is in there," a voice called out. Bow. The sound of it, so familiar, so steeped in a history of fear and command, made Anli flinch as if struck. "This is a family matter. Send her out." The silence inside the cabin stretched, thick and heavy. Abner's stillness was a physical force, a wall of absolute refusal. "There's a man in town, a Sheriff Miller," Bow's voice called again, laced with a false reasonableness. "He knows we are here. Do not make this difficult." Finally, Abner moved. He did not reach for the rifle. He simply lifted the heavy iron bar from the door and let it fall to the floor with a loud clang. He pulled the door open just enough to step into the frame, his massive body completely blocking the entrance. He stood there, unarmed, his hands hanging loose at his sides, and looked down at the 2 men. Bow and June stood a few yards away, their faces pinched with cold and frustration. They were dressed for the city, their coats inadequate for the mountain's bite. They looked small and out of place against the vast backdrop of snow and stone. Abner was the one who belonged here. He was part of the landscape they were trespassing on. "She is not yours," Abner said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of the mountain behind it. It was a statement of irrefutable fact. Bow's face flushed with anger. "She is my daughter, our blood. We have come to take her home." "This is her home," Abner replied, his gaze unwavering. June, ever the more direct instrument of his father's will, took a step forward, his hand moving to the inside of his coat. "Step aside, old man." Abner's eyes shifted to June, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. There was no anger in his expression. There was something far colder, a deep, primal warning. "There is no place for you here," Abner said, his voice dropping even lower. "The mountain does not want you. Turn around. Walk away. Do not look back." Inside, An Li pushed herself to her feet. She moved to stand behind him, not in his shadow but at his shoulder, where they could see her. She wanted them to see. She was no longer the broken thing they had left to die. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. Her chin was lifted. Her presence was her answer. Bao's eyes found hers, and for a moment his face contorted with a fresh wave of fury. He saw not his fragile, lost daughter, but a defiant stranger standing beside a giant. His property had been stolen. His authority had been challenged. "She comes with us," Bao snarled, all pretense of civility gone. He gave a sharp nod to his son. June lunged forward. The unthinkable act was not one of noise, but of brutal, shocking silence. As June charged, his hand reaching for the pistol hidden in his coat, Abner moved. It was not the clumsy rush of a big man, but a blur of speed and power, the explosive strike of a grizzly. He did not meet June's attack head on. He sidestepped, his left hand shooting out to grip June's wrist, the one reaching for the gun. There was a sickening crack of bone. June screamed, a high, thin sound that was instantly cut off as Abner's other hand clamped around his throat, lifting him clear off his feet. June's legs dangled uselessly, kicking at the air. His face turned a deep, mottled purple, his eyes bulging with terror and disbelief. Abner held him there, suspended and powerless, his expression unchanged. He was not angry. He was merely removing a threat. He looked at Bao, who stood frozen, his face a mask of horror. The entire violent exchange had taken less than 3 seconds. Abner squeezed, just enough. The fight went out of June completely. He went limp, a puppet with its strings cut. Abner then tossed him aside. June landed in a heap in the snow, gasping and choking, clutching his shattered wrist. Abner then turned his full attention to Bao. He took one slow, deliberate step forward, then another. Bao stumbled backward, his arrogance and fury replaced by a primal, gut-wrenching fear. He looked at Abner, this force of nature that had just dismantled his son without breaking a sweat, and he saw his own mortality. He saw the end of his power. Abner did not run. He walked. He walked Bao back, step by step, away from the cabin, away from An Li. Bao tripped and fell, scrambling backward in the snow like a crab. Abner stood over him, a living mountain casting a long, dark shadow. He bent down, not to strike, but to speak, his voice a low, terrifying whisper that only Bao could hear. "She is free of you. If you ever return to this mountain, if you ever speak her name again, if I ever hear so much as a whisper of you in the wind, I will not be this gentle." He did not need to elaborate. The promise was absolute. He then straightened up, turned his back on the pathetic man scrabbling in the snow, and walked back to the cabin. He did not look back. He did not need to. He knew they would not return. He stepped back inside, his gaze finding An Li. She stood exactly where he had left her, her eyes wide. She had witnessed it all, the brutal efficiency, the controlled, overwhelming power, the final, terrible severing of her past. He closed the door, shutting out the sight of her father helping her broken brother to his feet, their retreat a stumbling, humiliating crawl down the mountainside. He slid the heavy bar back into place. The sound was final, a lock turning on a history of pain. He looked at An Li, and for the first time, he saw not a victim, but an equal, a fellow survivor. A new kind of silence settled over the cabin in the days that followed. The quiet of before had been born of caution and uncertainty. This quiet was different. It was the calm that follows a storm, a silence of safety, of permanence. The threat had been met and vanquished. The ghosts had been exorcised. An Li no longer started at every sound, no longer clutched the gray blanket like a shield. She moved with a newfound grace, a quiet confidence that came from knowing the door was barred against her past, not by wood and iron, but by the will of the man who shared her small world. He had not just saved her life, he had given it back to her, whole and unencumbered. You learn in the harshest of winters that freedom isn't an idea. It is a physical space. It is a locked door. It is a protector who stands in the threshold and says, "No more." It is the quiet, steady work of building a life on the ashes of the one that was stolen from you. An Lee began to truly live in the cabin. She learned to read the sky for weather, to identify the tracks of deer and fox in the snow. She learned the rhythm of his life, and slowly it became hers as well. They still spoke little, but their communication ran deeper than words. It was in the way he left a pail of water where she could easily reach it, in the way she mended a tear in his coat before he even noticed it was there. It was a partnership, forged in violence and tempered in silence. One afternoon, she took the old, faded pink dress from the corner where it had lain for weeks. She held it for a moment, the fabric a whisper of a former life, a girl she barely remembered. She did not fold it. She did not store it away. She walked to the hearth and without ceremony laid it in the fire. The flames licked at the delicate fabric, consuming it in a bright, hungry flare. The pink turned to black, then to ash. She watched it burn until it was nothing, then turned away. Abner was watching her from across the room. He gave a single slow nod of understanding. That evening, as they sat at the table, sharing a meal of roasted rabbit and dried berries, he spoke. "My name is Abner," he said. It was an offering, a final brick laid in the foundation of their new world. She met his gaze across the flickering candlelight, and for the first time since he had found her, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. "I know," she said softly. The winter would be long, as he had said, but it was no longer an enemy. It was just a season. Outside, the snow fell, blanketing the mountain in a fresh, clean layer of white. It covered the tracks of the men who had come and gone. It covered the past. Inside the small log cabin, two people, a man of the mountain and a woman who had found her strength, sat in the warm golden light, their quiet presence a testament to the resilient, stubborn, and beautiful nature of survival. The future was an unwritten page, but for the first time, An Lee felt ready to read it.